If you've watched a lot of videos on this channel, then I know I sound like a broken record when I say that the 1920s is often considered a golden age in the United States, but it's true. And 100 years later, in the new 20s, many people still keep going back to the 1920s for its charm and aesthetic. And in this video, we're gonna go through some of the things that really gave the Roaring Twenties such a long-lasting positive legacy. A quick disclaimer, I will focus mainly on the US because that's what I know best, and the 1920s was so drastically different from region to region that a global survey is very difficult to do well. And this video is more of an overview than a deep dive, so if you're already well versed in the 1920s, it might not provide any revelations for you. So anyway, let's start with one of the most iconic symbols of the decade, flappers. I've talked about them a lot on this channel, and although not everything about them could be considered positive, they did represent a wider movement of liberation for women, who had made a significant push away from the strict gender roles of the Victorian era. And if you watched my Myths and Misconceptions Part 2 video, you'll know that there was a wide spectrum of women who were considered flappers, many of which wouldn't necessarily match our idea of what a flapper was. Flappers were stereotyped as materialistic, overindulgent, and airheaded, not to mention morally improper. And for some observers, if a young woman simply danced to jazz, she could be labeled a flapper, even if she didn't have other flapper characteristics like smoking, going to petting parties, putting on a lot of makeup, and dating countless men. Flappers pushed the boundaries of the established social order. Behavior that had previously been considered unladylike became at least somewhat more normalized. And while it's not directly related to flappers, the implementation of the 19th Amendment in 1920 was a sign of the greater women's movement. This amendment gave women the right to vote, which many of them exercised for the first time in the 1920 presidential election. And I think we can all agree that that was a good thing. But of course, flappers weren't an organized movement like the suffragettes, but a social phenomenon. There might be a lot of misconceptions about flappers, but they certainly made their contributions to society and pop culture. Another enduring symbol of the 1920s is jazz. With jazz, there really isn't anything negative to say about it. It's true that jazz became oversaturated in the 1920s, much like rock and roll in the 1950s, but it provided the soundtrack of a generation, so for that small flaw, it gets a pass in my book. The later years of the decade saw the introduction to one of my all-time favorites, Duke Ellington. While not all of his 1920s recordings can be considered masterpieces, his orchestra made quite a few standout records within a very short time, and was a taste of what would come later. Ellington's characteristic use of unique instrumentation can be seen even at this early stage in his career. Listen to Black and Tan Fantasy or Creole Love Call, and compare those with some other recordings from the same time, and I think their uniqueness will speak for itself. And while jazz gets most of the attention, blues music also proved to be extremely influential, if not more so. The most famous blues singer from the 20s was definitely Bessie Smith. But the other flavor of blues, featuring men with acoustic guitars and emotional vocals, ended up being arguably the bigger influence on future musicians. Country music also became more ingrained in mainstream American culture through the likes of Jimmie Rodgers and the Carter Family. Both of these acts recorded their first records at the famous Bristol Sessions in 1927, which is usually regarded as the Big Bang of modern country music. The 1920s were a rather crazy time in America, and with a crazy atmosphere, crazes increasingly crop up. Crazes were so common that you might say they could even compete with the modern day in frequency. The most famous 1920s craze was the Charleston dance. The song was originally written in 1923 by the influential pianist James P. Johnson, and was used in the stage show Runnin' Wild that same year. The dance took America by storm for a few years, and became associated with the younger generation, especially flappers. Another dance craze was the black bottom. Compared to the Charleston, it's much more forgotten now for some reason. But the black bottom and the Charleston competed with each other for the top spot at around the same time. Another extremely catchy song called Doin' the Raccoon had a dance to go with it called The Raccoon. This one is interesting because it came from the college scene. All things collegiate were also trendy, and could possibly be considered a craze in itself. Another college-themed dance craze was the varsity drag, which also came with a song of the same title. There were plenty of other smaller dance crazes, but I do not have time to talk about all of them. Perhaps the most bizarre craze of the 1920s was flagpole sitting. I have no idea why people were so intrigued by it, but all over the country, people were sitting on flagpoles or other kinds of poles to demonstrate how long they could last up there. The person almost always credited with starting this craze was a man named Alvin Shipwreck Kelly. He did his first stint on a flagpole in 1924, and stayed up there for a modest 13 hours and 13 minutes. As the craze grew in popularity, Kelly and many others tried to set new records, sitting on flagpoles around the country for days or even weeks. There were also other kinds of endurance fads, most notably dancing marathons. Another 1920s craze that swept the country was crossword puzzles. They had started before the 1920s, but for one reason or another, they exploded in popularity then, reaching fever pitch in the middle years. I'll be posting a deep dive video on that one in the near future. One of the most well-known 1920s crazes was the Egyptomania craze that began after the discovery of King Tut's tomb in late 1922. The magnificent artifacts found in the tomb captured people's imaginations with their opulence and beauty. Ancient Egyptian-style motifs made their way into all kinds of art, including the ultra-modern Art Deco style. This craze actually spread around the entire Western world, and was part of the larger trend of exoticism. While Egypt got the biggest share of the attention, people were also wild about other exotic aesthetics from other ancient civilizations, like India, China, Japan, the Aztecs, and the Mayans. There was also increased interest in modern exotic places as well. And while this could often be pretty patronizing, it represented a more widespread curiosity of the wider world. With Charles Lindbergh's successful transatlantic flight in 1927, airplanes and aviation became a sort of craze too. It had been somewhat big before then. World War I had romanticized aviators, but when the war ended, this image faded away with it. During the 4 years of the Great War, airplanes had been a useful tactical machine. But by the dawn of the 1920s, they were largely confined to the civilian sphere. When Lindbergh became an overnight international celebrity, others jumped on the aviation bandwagon. Unlike most of the other crazes, this one could be quite dangerous, and there were a number of amateurs who died in crashes, but that didn't seem to discourage most who tried. Some other popular crazes were mahjong and, oddly enough, Freudian psychology. The sheer number of crazes in the 1920s is staggering, but most of them seem like a good time. These crazes added some silliness to the decade, and made it eccentric and sometimes downright absurd. Personally, the crazes are some of my favorite things about the 1920s. And since I mentioned Art Deco a little while ago, let's talk about that for a bit. I knew some people wouldn't forgive me if I didn't at least mention it in this video, so here it is. Art Deco might be more associated with the 1930s, but it first became popular in the second half of the 1920s. It had existed previously in the art world, but after the International Exhibition of Modern Decorative and Industrial Arts in Paris in 1925, it rapidly became more mainstream. Art styles are notoriously difficult to describe with words, but I'll give it a try. Art Deco is characterized by very geometric motifs. You often see long, straight lines that emphasize height, and it's often paired with sleekness, which is what I think gives it that modern kind of look. And as I mentioned before, Art Deco was also influenced by the exoticism craze, borrowing all sorts of colors and motifs from the aesthetics of various ancient civilizations and countries. My personal favorite symbol of the 1920s is radio. Radio started out the decade as more of an amateur's hobby, but absolutely exploded in mainstream popularity starting in mid-1922, and continued to be the most popular home entertainment throughout the rest of the decade, and all the way into the early 1950s, when television quickly overshadowed it. Radio was ubiquitous in the 1920s, and people's minds went wild imagining what radio could be capable of in the future, which is perfectly represented by this fascinating illustration. It might be hard now to appreciate how mind-blowing radio was back then. From a little box, you could hear broadcasts from far away through an invisible signal. You could hear dance bands, singers, orchestras, baseball games, boxing matches, plays, and even the president right there in your living room. Forgive the handful of people back then who thought it might be magic. It permeated all aspects of American society in such a short time. Radio could provide entertainment for blind people. It could be used for advertising, or practical communication with pilots flying overhead, or to control an entire ship. It was also part of the emerging idea of television, where a radio signal could actually be displayed visually. With music being a big part of radio programming, you could argue that radio is really what made the Roaring Twenties roar. But there was a wide variety of other programs, with probably the most influential genre being sitcoms, most famously with Amos and Andy in the late 1920s. If you want to get an idea of what an average day of radio programming was like, here's a programming schedule that I chose at random from a radio magazine. Hollywood really came into its own in the 1920s as well. Of course, like radio, it had existed before, but it accelerated after World War I had ended. The star system and the studio system took over by the middle of the decade, with stars having a large and dedicated following, and big studios gobbling up smaller ones and making bigger productions. And those same big studios had their own theaters or luxurious movie palaces that gave the movie-watching experience more class, even though they were monopolistic. But just as silent films were reaching their zenith, talkies quickly took over, which decreased the overall quality of movies temporarily, but added a fascinating new novelty in the process. Technicolor even made occasional appearances, especially in the later years, to double down on the wow factor. To those who don't like such novelties, there's still the underappreciated legacy of silent films. Big Hollywood studios usually funded 1 or 2 prestige pictures a year. These were more artistic films that were not expected to smash the box office, but would hopefully win prestige for the studio. And many of these are the movies that are most well remembered now, such as King Vidor's The Crowd and Erich von Stroheim's Greed. And outside of Hollywood, especially in Europe, there were plenty of thought-provoking works of film art for those wanting something more artistic, or something with more depth, such as the works of Carl Theodor Dreyer and Abel Gance. And even in Hollywood, movies like The Big Parade, The Kid, Ben-Hur, The Gold Rush, and Wings, among many, many others, were masterpieces of popular entertainment. Perhaps the longest-lasting legacy, in the popular imagination at least, are the fashionable actors and actresses that people went absolutely gaga over. Some actresses have been especially enduring fashion icons, with perhaps the most popular these days being Louise Brooks or Clara Bow. And at the movie theater, you could watch a variety of other things, like newsreels, comedy shorts, and cartoons. And the reason I mention that is because I have to talk about Felix the Cat. I would say that Felix was the best cartoon from the 1920s. Disney and Steamboat Willie get all the attention, but the Felix shorts were so witty and often very relevant to the culture of the time. They often addressed current events in a tongue-in-cheek or satirical way, so I think that makes it a more interesting artifact from that time period. And Felix even met Charlie Chaplin and Douglas Fairbanks. Well, in animated form at least. I guess you could say that the Felix the Cat shorts were kind of like the Looney Tunes of the 1920s, in terms of quality and popularity. As I've already mentioned, the transition to talkies was a big, unique feature of the 1920s movie experience. But there's another rather unique one that I have to talk about too: movie palaces. They were big and ornately decorated, with the largest ones seating a few thousand people. But it wasn't just the look of the theaters, but the programs they offered. Small theaters often put on a short prologue show on stage, but the big movie palaces had full orchestras to perform extensive musical pieces, as well as other stage performances. The matinees were a full evening of entertainment. The feature film was quite literally only half the show. While the number of movie palaces was relatively small compared to the tens of thousands of smaller theaters, they made up for it with a unique experience. They continued to exist for a while after the 1920s, but they often didn't live up to quite the same standard as they did in their heyday. Of course, there are still some movie palaces out there, but out of necessity, they can't offer the same experience that they once did. For this video, I wanted to include things that either characterized, are unique to, or started in the 1920s, so just saying art or literature in general is a bit too obvious. Of course, every decade had a lot of great literature, though you could say that the 1920s had an especially productive output. Among the great novels were Ulysses, The Great Gatsby, The Sun Also Rises, A Farewell to Arms, All Quiet on the Western Front, Mrs. Dalloway, and the novels of Agatha Christie and Sinclair Lewis, just to name a few. But the Harlem Renaissance is something a bit more unique that should be mentioned. And because it started in the 1920s, it definitely deserves a place in this video. The Harlem Renaissance was a flourishing period of Black artistic expression that centered in the Harlem district of New York City. Black writers and poets who were part of this movement expressed pride in their race, sadness or anger at being rejected by white society, and longing for racial equality. The Harlem Renaissance is probably most strongly associated with literature, but it also extended to all other kinds of art as well. Some of the more prominent names from the Harlem Renaissance are Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, Zora Neale Hurston, Paul Robeson, and Oscar Micheaux. The 1920s was also a golden age for sports. Baseball was the all-American sport, and the 20s witnessed the likes of such legendary names as Ty Cobb, Rogers Hornsby, Lou Gehrig, and of course, Babe Ruth. The 1920s began just as the sport was transitioning from the dead ball era to the home run era, where power hitting became the main attraction, and games generally had more runs than before. And since games with more runs were more exciting for fans, attendance at ballparks soared. This was also an important time for Major League Baseball, as it was still recovering from the 1919 Black Sox scandal, where the World Series was alleged to have been fixed that year. Babe Ruth, among others, helped people regain their trust in the game. Outside of baseball, there was the other most popular spectator sport: boxing. Jack Dempsey was America's golden boy in the ring after winning the World Heavyweight title in 1919, and he defended his title in a number of high-profile matches. He fought French boxer Georges Carpentier on July 2, 1921, the Argentine boxer Luis Firpo on September 14, 1923, and Gene Tunney on September 23, 1926. Dempsey lost that last match, then did a rematch with Tunney exactly a year later and lost again, with a massive controversy about the referee's actions. Those Dempsey-Tunney fights were two of the biggest events in America in the 1920s, especially the 1927 one. Football also became far more mainstream in the 1920s, especially in colleges. Being a successful football player in college became a status symbol, a tried-and-true strategy for becoming the big man on campus. And as college culture spread, so did the college students' love of football. This period saw the emergence of early football stars such as Jim Thorpe and Red Grange. And with all of these sports being broadcast over the radio, they were far more accessible than ever. Everyone could participate, and sports became one of the biggest pieces of shared culture in the US. America in the 1920s was also a place of relative prosperity. America had lost virtually none of its infrastructure during the war, and hadn't suffered from the widespread political instability that much of the rest of the Western world had. This is a part of what made the 1920s in America so eccentric. Though some people might bitterly remind you that America was also the debt collector of Europe at the time. And with most of the previous rivals for economic superiority out of the picture for the moment, America's prosperity seemed all the more exaggerated. And important things like radios and cars could be very affordable. By the late 1920s, you could buy a radio for about the same as a PlayStation 5 now, though that was on the lower end. The difference is that once you had the radio, you didn't have to pay extra to enjoy the vast amount of programs available, only for occasional maintenance. And while the price of a Ford Model T fluctuated a bit throughout the decade, it hit its lowest price in 1925 with a cost of $260. That's only about $4,600 in the present day. So those are the main things that I think made the 1920s so great. But did I miss something? Do you disagree with any of my choices? Let me know in the comments. Now, before some people jump on me, there will be a companion video where I'll talk about some of the bad things about the 1920s. I'm sure that there were some people ready to call me out for not addressing them, so I'm letting you know now that I didn't forget or purposely exclude them, because I don't want to sugarcoat the past. Well, that's all for now, all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.